All right. I am here with Shari and I'm Jess. We want to talk about the U-shaped journey. We already started talking a bit. Shari's got her coffee and
ready to roll.
So let me introduce this. So the U-shaped journey has kind of been something that I've been thinking about and kind of jamming out to for the past year or so, maybe even longer.
Longer, Jess.
Well, under that name.
Yeah.
It's actually been something that's been stirring for, probably my whole life. So, so the U-shaped journey, I kind of came to the name of it because there's, sorry, I have something open that was making noise. That there's is kind of a mix between Kurt Vonnegut's Shape of a Story and the U-shape of a story and Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. So maybe I'll just start with that clip of Kurt Vonnegut.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really. Is the shape of the curves are what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start the whole thing. We call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
And this is kind of what got me started about it. I was like, why do we find stories meaningful? And then when I saw that, like in like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, it's like the classic one is the hero goes out and back, goes away from home and then comes back home, or goes out and fights the dragon and, then comes back. Right. Why do we find that so meaningful? And because you can tell a story that doesn't have a U shape, where basically I went to the store, I had a good day, nothing really happened. You could tell that, but that's not a story. It's boring.
Yeah.
You don't find it meaningful. So I was like, why do we find it meaningful when the story falls apart? Because when you're going to the store, you have like a narrative that you're like, I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to get this and that and that. And on the way to the store, I get hit, I get in a traffic accident. Now we have a story because my narrative was interrupted. The story has fallen apart. Right. So yeah, I've I like the phrase, the story is not a story till the story falls apart. And
it's kind of a deconstruction, actually, when you think about it, Jess.
The deconstruction process. Yeah.
Well, the story falling apart it's a deconstruction.
Yeah.
Of the story itself.
It is. And you'll see people play with that. There'll be like the classic hero tale. And then they'll play with aspects of it where you're like, oh, this is the part where this happens. I already know what's going to happen. And then that doesn't happen. Something else happens and it starts to disintegrate. And you're like, what's going on? Like, we got to get back on track. We got to get back to the story. So we find that meaningful. And, And so you see the same pattern also in Christ. You see him, he's in heaven, he descends, he's incarnated, he dies, goes down to Hades and hell, and then is resurrected again to the highest place. Yeah. And like, what is Jesus doing there? And why do we find that meaningful? We're told like he's paying for our sin. That's how sin is paid for. Is the U-shaped journey just about that? And, the more I look into it, like it's something even bigger than that, because I'm going through Hebrews now in a Bible study, and it says that Christ is the foundation of the universe. Like we're talking about creation here. We're talking about how, and it's not just like, this was the best thing that's ever been done. And so, and the best, this pain for sin and whatever is, I think it's a lot deeper than that. I think it has to do with how things exist and how things be and become. And I think it's all a part of Christ. Like everything that is participates in their being as imitating Christ in his being. And I'll try to hopefully we can kind of talk more about that, because I think that's important to the whole U-shaped story, is being and becoming.
Yeah.
But I want to point that out. And then, and I guess I'll just mention Job here, because Job was also really important in my thinking about this, is that Job takes this U-shaped journey. He's on top of the world. He is a righteous man who's doing everything right. He's got a good family. He's got wealth and prosperity because of his righteousness. And then it all gets taken away. He falls down into the pit, so to speak. And then God raises him up even higher after that. And what's going on there? Well, I think a clue is what is God talking about at the end of the book of Job? God's talking about creation. Job and his friends throughout the whole middle part of the book are concerned about justice and what, who's right, who's wrong, what, his friends are concerned that Job is slandering God, and Job is saying that you're just trying to appease God with your flowery language and your useless words, and Job's defending his innocence, and they're talking all about justice, and God comes in and talks about creation.
Yeah. The one thing I'd like to add to that, which, these are just some things, because you and I have been talking about this together for a long time.
Yeah.
And you often refer to the ostrich, the example that God gives of the ostrich, right?
Yeah, the ostrich is perfect.
She's so dumb that she actually just abandons her children, but look at how she can run, and you wonder, why is God saying that? Why is he doing that? Like, running is better than, looking after your kids. Like, I don't know, like, it doesn't seem right.
Well, and it's also the only part in all of his speech where God talks about himself in the third person. He says her creator didn't make her very bright. Like, he's taking a step back and was like, whoever made that over there didn't make her very bright. Like, didn't give her very much wisdom. And you're just like, you did that. But he's kind of taking a step. It's fascinating. Well, it's kind of
like, it's like show and tell, Yep. But you and I have talked about this, but there are these three layers to the scriptures, right? The literal, the moral, ethical, and the spiritual layers of the scriptures. And I thought, okay, well, if that's to be found in the scriptures themselves, in all of the scriptures, then it also that pattern must lay itself out throughout the scriptures. And because he's always going, hello, woohoo, hello. So I'm like, where is the big pattern? Like, I can see the little I can see all the fractal pattern happening, but where's the big message? Because I know it's in here. And then because I was doing the book of Revelation with Nate and Michael, and it's a mirror. It's in Emil Bach's book. He proposes that it's a mirror image of the creation story. Excuse me. Oh, I've got the remnants of a cold.
You're still recovering.
So I thought, okay, well, there's creation in Genesis, there's creation in Revelation, so there must be somewhere in the middle. And then I was like, oh, wait, Job. So it's like the literal creation is in Genesis. The moral and ethical story of creation is in Job. And then the spiritual story of creation, right? Those three layers are in Revelation. And so, and what is the U-shaped journey talking about? Oh, it's talking about Christ, right? Like you said.
Yep.
So, Job goes through his U-shaped journey, right? Like, we see that in the book of Job. He's, like you said, he starts out up here, he goes to the bottom, and then he comes back up again. But when God speaks to him in the whirlwind, where's the U-shaped journey there? That's the thing that I ask myself. And it dawned on me, and maybe I'm wrong, but that when God talks about the ostrich, he's talking about Christ. Because what he's saying there is that the wisdom of God is foolishness to men, right? So what appears to be completely confounding, right? You look at the ostrich and you go, what? Why? I mean, even God proposes that it's confounding to Job.
Yep.
Right? But what he's actually saying is the wisdom of God is foolishness to men, right? And there was another scripture that I thought of in connection to that. I can't think of it at the moment. But anyway, I just wanted to add that, because I think that's important to the idea that this is a fractal pattern. Like, even in a book, in a story, a story is actually kind of boring if there's just one big U-shaped journey. right, in the story.
Yep.
The story, it becomes more and more complex the more U-shaped journeys
Are
you find
woven together.
Right.
Well, and there's something about that weaving is making U's, going up and down through
It is
the fabric.
That's good. Yeah.
So, I
Totally,
just
Jess.
see
I never even
that.
thought of that.
Well, I just see that, the pattern is everywhere. And normally so maybe I'd like to, we know about the fall. We're here in paradise, and then we came down and we fell, and then Christ saved us and rose us up. Like, that's a U-shaped journey. And we're like, how usually that's what people think of when they think of it. And they're like, that's not good. It's good that we came out of that. And what I would like to say is, like, no, that's how things get created. It's how they become something. And so what, I'm not saying the fall was good in itself, but what we have is the pattern in which the fall plays into the pattern of how God creates everything. So this is not a problem for God. God is going to recreate everything, and that's what we see him do in Christ. He's like, I'm going to renew the world. I'm going to make a new creation, and I'm going to redeem everything that fell. He's like, this is just what I do.
Yeah.
We think that he's only doing this because we sinned. And I would like to say, I was like, no, this is just what God does, at least as far as creation is concerned. This is just what God does. And our sin is just another, our sin is actually shrinking back from that. It's not participating in that. So
there you go.
You can say that we're called as images of God. We're made in the image of Christ. We're called to follow the same pattern, and it's not something that you can manipulate or control, or it's something to go through.
Yeah.
So you'll go through it, and
you circumvent it. Well, you don't become anything.
Right. like the child who grows up in a house, never leaves home. His mom and dad take care of him.
Never falls down, never scrapes his knee.
He doesn't have to get a job. His parents take care of him. He's 50 years old. He's still living at home. His mom is taking care of him, probably resents him.
And her.
Yeah. What is that? He hasn't become anything.
Right.
He's not a person yet in a sense. And so there's these times in which, the U-shaped journey is how things get made. So like, take Harry Potter.
What about this? Like, Jesus says, behold, I make all things new.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, like, I make all things new, right? So, which is what the story of creation is about. He made those things, right? And then there was the fall, and now they are being made new, right? So it's like the parable of the seed. When he says, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, right? Mm-hmm. It can't become something new. Like when it comes up, it's not a seed anymore. It doesn't come out of the ground as a little seed and lay on the top of this soil. It comes out of the ground as a plant, right? And produces fruit. So, because every plant does.
Right. And the seed is the fulfillment of its purpose. But unless it goes in the ground and dies, it's can't.
The potential. It's the seed is a potential. And the death and resurrection is the fulfillment of its becoming.
Right.
Right.
Well, and you see the same thing in Genesis 2.
Yeah.
And when God says it's not good for man to be alone. And what happens immediately after that? The man goes and names the animals. So God brings the animals to him. And Jonathan Pajot talks about how it's a sort of a descent, because the man's in the garden. He talks about, like, it doesn't say it in there, but talks about, like, you can imagine him going, the garden's on a mountain. The rivers are all flowing out from the top of the mountain. He descends to the animals. I mean, animals are below us. They're like, and so there's all this sort of symbolism of this descent that Adam takes to name the animals. Even like naming, it's like, it's fragmentary, and it's like you're getting into the details of things, and you're not concerned about the big picture at that moment. You've descended, but that's how we participate. That's how Adam participated in the creation of the animals, because God formed them and brought them to him, and he names them. So Adam's taking this descent to name them. And then what happens after that? Adam falls into a deep, deep sleep. So you can sense that he goes down even further. And then what happens is his rib is taken and Eve is formed.
Right.
And it wakes up, and this is like, and then they go back to the garden together. And there's a sense in which Adam was a seed and had gone down and died, and Eve was born, and now it's man and woman. Like, Eve was within him at that time, and then it's almost the same as like a seed blooming. Yeah. And this is also,
I don't know what you think of this, and I don't even know if I'm using it in the right way. But it's also, to me, that's the beginning of our wrestling with duality, right? It's like when the feminine and the masculine are taken apart, right? Then all of a sudden the world becomes dualistic, I think. I don't know what you think.
Well, there's even the dualism on day 2, when, well, there's the dualism between light and darkness, first of all, in day 1. Mm-hmm. And then there's the separation of the waters on day 2. But day 2 is interesting because I keep thinking about this because it's the only day where God doesn't see that it is good. Right. Every other day it says, and God saw that it was good. You know, on day 1, God saw the light was good. And there was night and day, or day and night in the first day. And then it goes through the separation of the waters above and the waters below. And it doesn't say that God saw it was good. And there's something in there where,
is that the vertical relationship? Like maybe the laws of transcendence? I'm not sure.
Well, I think that's part of it because, well, this gets into kind of the nature of the Trinity, which we've been talking about on the Voxer, but you can, let me just outline this quickly, because it's the same U-shaped journeys. The relationship between the Father, Son, and Spirit are the same, is the same sort of pattern. You have the Father, the infinite, the ineffable, the transcendent. Mm-hmm. Okay. And now the question is, how can anything exist apart from God?
Yeah.
Now, in a way, nothing exists apart from God. Like everything in him, we live and breathe and have our being.
Yeah.
There's another way in which God has separated himself from us in order that we may choose something. Ideally, we would choose him again. And so the pattern I'm using here would be Christ on the cross. And this is George MacDonald's sermon, the Eloi, where Christ says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Mm-hmm. And so this is the separation. And George MacDonald says such a good line here is like God forsook his son so that the divine will of the son would
orient itself,
would be made known. I'm just getting choked up just trying to say it.
I can tell.
I'm hopeless, Shari. It's a condition.
I know. Okay. It's all good.
So God separates himself so that the divine will of the Son would be made known. And that will was my God, was back towards his Father. And so the divine will is there shown most clearly. It shines most brightly, but the issue or the divine will in Christ shines most clearly, but there had to be that separation that would allow that. So back to the Trinity, we have the ineffable, infinite Father. Now, how does anything exist apart from him? Well, there has to be some sort of space created that God creates so that something can be manifest, something can be okay. And you see this throughout the whole Genesis creation account. God makes a space and then fills it. God makes a space and then fills it. God makes a space and then fills it. And even like the tohu wabohu, when he says the earth was formless and void, it meant there was no spaces made in it, and then there was nothing in it. It was empty. So it was just like it was everything but nothing all at the same time. So it had no form, and then it was empty. So what God does is he gives something form, makes a space, and then something can become in that space. And so to the degree which God separates himself from the creation is the degree in which it becomes real. Because the other question is like, are we all just in God's dream? Are we just figments of his imagination? Or are we just his puppets? Is he just pulling all the strings and this is all an illusion?
Yeah.
Well, the Christian creation story says no, that there's this separation, and that what he really desires is that we become real. Like it's like Pinocchio or something. Like he wants real children. He wants real sons and daughters.
Well, and then you could, to understand that idea of real better, it's like the seed, right? That dies in the ground. Like the seed is not real. Like when my husband and I plant a garden every year, and we hold seeds in our hand, and they're useless to us unless they become a plant.
Right.
Like I can't sell a broccoli seed as a broccoli until it becomes a plant and produces broccoli. It's not real. Right. It's just potential. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. That's all it is, really.
Right. And so seems to be like how God creates. And there's a sense in which his separation from us is also the thing that allows us to become something.
Yeah.
So, the dark night of the soul, the example I like to use is a father with his son on a bicycle, where the son's learning to ride a bike. And there's a time when the father holds on to his son and is pushing him around, letting his son, practice pedaling and all that. And then there's a time when the father lets go of the son.
Yeah.
In order that the son becomes a bike rider.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the son becomes greater because of that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And the ultimate experience when you're learning to ride a bike is look, no hands.
Right.
Right. Then you're super real.
Right.
Like you and the bike are one, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got the balance, you got the speed, you're doing the thing,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And there's even, we experience this as we grow up, like when we leave our parents' house and we start making decisions for ourselves, good or bad, we start figuring out who we are. Like we may make some bad decisions and be like, oh, I didn't know that, I didn't know that was in me to do that. And or maybe you make some good decisions and you have the same reaction. And then and so so anyway, that all kind of falls in my mind under the same pattern of this U-shaped journey. So sort of like connection, separation, connection again. And so we can't exist without our Father. And so like we go out in order to become, but also we have to return to him. So this is how I would even just define hell, would be like you just separate yourself and you don't come back. And what do you have? Well, you have, I think at its worst, it becomes like an internal self turning, where you're always looking at yourself, turning in on yourself, and there's nothing outside yourself. And this would be the definition of hell for me. And what we need is to return back to the transcendent in order, to maybe take the journey again. But so that's.
I was just thinking about, like every morning I get up and I go and I sit outside and in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one morning, was about 2 weeks ago now, I think. I was sitting there and I could hear thump, 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 thump on the ground, and then ping, because there was a hit, whatever it was, hit something. Like we have a little, we have an outdoor shower, and we have our on-demand hot water heater for it is covered by a little metal roof. Hit that, and I was like, what is going on? And I thought maybe there's an animal in the tree and it's knocking branches down or something, and I go over and I'm looking at this huge fir tree.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden these 3 little pine cones come down, and then I look on the ground and it's just covered with pine cones. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm watching a tree do something. It's giving birth. It is.
It is.
All its babies are dropping to the ground, right? And this tree did this for, I don't know, probably a week, And those pine cones are nothing. They're nothing unless they die and become another fir tree.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the expectation of the tree itself, right?
Right.
That's why it's dropping those
Mm-hmm.
cones, because it
Mm-hmm.
expects that to happen, right?
Right.
And what's even more interesting about like northern boreal forests is that they're actually made to burn, okay? And it's through fire that a lot of these trees germinate, these
Right.
cones on the ground. They'll germinate after fire.
Yep.
And
Yeah, the fire like actually opens up the place where the cone's holding the seed, so the seeds.
they will germinate without fire, actually, because
There's certain cones that won't.
Constantly ripping them out.
Right.
But the whole forest itself is made to burn. It's the boreal forest is like just waiting for a lightning bolt,
Right.
because it needs that. It needs the fire in order to regenerate itself.
Mm-hmm.
And
and one of the worst ways we've managed our forests is by stopping fires.
yes,
Where just all the fuel just burns, like builds up, and then the fire that starts from that is just so hot and so terrible that it actually destroys everything. Like it doesn't.
What it is actually is that when the forest is really interesting, and I think it has a lot to do with what we're talking about, because when the forest doesn't have the opportunity to regenerate itself, it becomes ill.
Mm-hmm.
And pathogens can grow in the soil and make the trees even more ill. Okay. So when there's a forest fire, after every fire, my husband picks morels. And so you can just kind of, in the spring, after the fire season in the fall, or in the summer before, the following spring, you just get the map out, you look where the fires were, and you go there and you pick morels because they're in abundance. And morels only grow on sterilized ground. They won't, so they'll grow without fire. But the reason they're in such abundance after fire is because the ground has been sterilized.
Right.
Okay, so part of the process of regeneration is also this purification of the soil. Because if that doesn't happen, the soil is full of pathogens, the trees become ill, and then they can't fight fire, because trees can actually fight fire, right? They also can't fight pests. And the pests come in and they kill the trees, and then you have a lot of standing dead timber, and then you end up with really aggressive fire behavior.
Right.
So, I mean, this is something that I know a lot about because I've been evacuated 3 times because of forest fires.
Yeah. And I grew up in Idaho and lived in Colorado, and it's forest fires every year. All
the time. Yeah. So, but like back to the fir tree, what's interesting too is that when that tree, when that cone dies and becomes a tree, it actually grows like this, right? And when I see trees, that's what I see. I see a lot of thanksgiving and a lot of gratitude and a lot of transcendence. That's what I see. They're returning to the thing that they came from, right? Yeah.
And they're also becoming more like the thing they came from.
Yeah.
And, as far as like, we're supposed to be like Christ, I mean, that's the pattern we're supposed to follow. And like I said, you can't necessarily manipulate it or wield it. People, I think, try in different ways, but it's something you just go through, and God will just work out through in you.
But the other thing too about that, sorry, Jess,
go ahead.
Dawned on me. The other thing too about the tree, okay, because like I said, God's always going, hello, woohoo. So everywhere you see this pattern, like you said.
Yeah, everywhere.
The other thing about the tree is that the cone is nestled in this garden, right? Yeah. And what does it have to do to become something? It has to fall.
Yeah.
It has to descend. It has to go down to the ground. And the tree, the mother, the one giving birth, lets go of it. Okay. That's the only way the cone can fall.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, this is the same story with the kid on the bike. The only way the kid learns to ride is if the father lets go. And yeah, that's really good.
So then my question is, why can't we say, in light of all this that we've just talked about, why can't we say that the fall was good? What hinders us? Is it sacrilegious to say that the fall was good?
Well, I think, the fall, I would redefine the fall.
Yeah.
Because we kind of think the fall was, we should have stayed in the garden. And I think that's wrong.
No,
I think, and even God, like, there's parallels to like the cone falling from the tree, like, and consciousness. So like, as people become conscious, you become aware, you start having a will, you start being able to make choices, then there's a certain there's a fall that happens. I guess like, you deliberate whether God is good or not. How is that? Why would God allow that? And then you could even decide God is not good, and he's actually malevolent in some way, and I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to act out and try to hurt him or hurt the things he likes and loves. So there's all these problems, and they all exist simultaneously. That's the conceptual space I see between the two waters. Right. As God makes this space where things can actually be, there exists the possibility for evil. And there's the argument, like, like God wanted love in the world. So in order for there to be love, he wanted free choice. And without free choice, we can't really have love. So because God wanted love, we got to put up with evil. I think the problem's much, much deeper than that. I think it has to do with being itself. God wanted things to actually be, God wanted things to actually be real. And that's what brings about the possibility of evil, is that things are real. And love is, love is the, oh, you're all right. I'll just talk over the.
I'm just coughing and sneezing.
but love is like the unity and so since we're separated from God, like what keeps this all together? Well, love keeps it together.
Yeah.
God's love for us, first of all, the Father's love for us, and then our love towards him. Like that's why love is so important. It's the thing that keeps everything from just flying apart.
Right.
And this is why we're called to participate in creation. So creation, the universe is dynamic. It's still ongoing. And I would define sin and the fall as shrinking back from that, from not choosing not to participate in that. So,
well, the term missing the mark actually hits the target in that respect, right? Because the whole point is, like, if the pine cone falls down onto the ground and says, I'm not doing this, he's totally missing the point.
You're a pine cone. What do you mean you're not doing this? What are you going to do?
What else are you going to do? Get with the program, right? If the pine cone decides to become a tree, right? If it feels itself germinating and becoming a tree and it kicks against that, it's missing the point. Like, I think, well, I won't even get into that. That's too
yeah, but this gets into the dilemma of consciousness. Like, this is the things that come about when you introduce consciousness into people. When God breathes his spirit into people, this is the problems that develop. Now we can deliberate whether we want to be what we want to be and if we want to be at all. And we can choose not to if we want. And it's complicated because, like, I imagine in my mind, I'm like Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit, and it's so interesting, like reading through that story, because God says, if you eat it, you'll surely die. But, I think they eat it, and I imagine they saw Christ, the image they were made in, what they were called to participate in. They see his death and the death that they're called to in order to fully participate in as images of him. And then what they chose, they were like, we don't want to die. God is up to something creepy that I don't trust him, and I'm going to hide myself, and I'm going to cover up my vulnerabilities. And that's exactly what happens. They shrink back from the calling of Christ, which was to die and renew creation and to serve it. And
they didn't. I think, I don't know. I think, before they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is kind of interesting because they had a knowledge of evil. It was a something. I'll just say that. Leave it at that. They didn't know what they weren't. Let's put it that way, right? They didn't know what they were not. And in order to become something new, which is what Christ does, behold, I make all things new. So there's two things going on there. I make all things, but I also make them new, right? Mm-hmm. And that involves the U-shaped journey, just to, short form it. And so what was I going to say? Something came to my mind when you were talking about that. I think that when they saw their nakedness, it was also a form of a loss of transactional transcendence, right? It was a form of self-obsession. So where the
it
eyes
was turning in on yourself.
Well, the eyes literally go down.
Yep.
Right. Like if you think about that, it's a looking down, right? And not a looking up and anymore. And this is what happens. Crap, I have too many things going through my head right now.
I know, I got the same thing going on.
So it's like the Cain and Abel story is kind of like that. Where Abel is participating in the U-shaped journey. Like he's participating in being, let's say. He knows that whatever, like his offering doesn't even come from him, right? What he's offering, God gave him, and he's giving it back. Whereas with Cain, he's self-obsessed. This is mine, right? He's looking at his nakedness. He's bringing his thing to God, and God's going, no, that's not how you do it, right? It's not yours to begin with, Cain. And of course, Cain's upset about that because to him it's his, and you don't like my thing, but what's really interesting, like what's even more interesting about that story is that after he kills his brother, God doesn't kill him. He just marks him, right?
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about that is you have Abel, who is correctly participating, and he's also the younger brother. And it was said to Eve was like, your son, your offspring will crush the head of the serpent and break these curses. And so there's this like expectation, like Cain's going to do this. And then all of a sudden his offerings aren't being accepted, and Abel's is, and it's like,
and that's very prevalent, that secondborn getting the right.
Yeah, it happens throughout. And it's almost like, here's Abel correctly participating. He's going down, he's sacrificing, bringing something up towards God. And
he dies.
Cain, well, yeah. And Cain wants to do that. This is the other thing that's so strange. You're like, well, God will have a U-shaped story for Cain too. No, God was using Abel as the one to do it. And Cain should have humbled himself and accepted and maybe had Abel sacrifice on his behalf or teach him how or something, because it's like, I don't know. Because it's like Cain was like, I wanted to bring the sacrifice. I wanted to be accepted. Yeah,
but there's something there too, Jess, about Christ being the firstborn of all creation. Like Abel's death seems absolutely stupid. It's like, what? Right. What a waste of a life. Yep. It's kind of falls under the only the good die young category, right?
Right.
What? Why? But that's what happened to Jesus, right? He was the good, and he died, but by his death, all things were made new. All of creation was made new, right? And the firstborn, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. Maybe if Jacob watches this, he could tell me. But I don't know if the firstborn symbolizes like humanity. And because there's this usurping of the right of the firstborn all through the Old Testament, given to the second one, right? Yeah. And then the second one actually becomes the firstborn. And I'm just thinking out loud right now.
Well, and it's like Adam's the firstborn, and then Christ is the secondborn. But then it's revealed that he was actually before Adam. He is the foundation of everything.
Well, yes, there's that. But from Sam would agree with this perfectly. but from a literal perspective, there's Adam, and then there's Christ,
Mhm.
right? So on that linear timeline,
Yep.
you've got the firstborn and the secondborn,
Yeah.
and the secondborn usurps basically redeems the whole family,
Mm-hmm.
which is what is indicated by the firstborn, right? He represents the whole family,
Mm-hmm.
like, and the secondborn redeems that, right? Which is, to me, the family of humanity. So, like, Adam is humanity, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know if we got off track there.
Well, we did a bit, but let's, so, well, let's, I mean, you keep seeing this pattern play out, and you see it again in Noah. So I think because Cain kills Abel, there's a curse on the land, and then and the land doesn't bring forth fruit very easily. So there's this curse, and there's a genealogy. I think I'm getting this right. And then we get to Noah, and when Noah's born, his father or mother said that your son will be the one to break in the curse on the land, and then we have the flood. Now, and the interesting thing about that is, like, a lot of the early agricultural societies, they lived on floodplains because the soil was fertile. When the river flooded, it's the same thing as the fire you're talking about. It purified the land, and
deposit stuff too,
and deposited stuff. So the thing is to work with the flood cycle, so that you didn't build your house there. You arrange your crops so that you're working with this pattern of, you grow things up, and then the flood would come and take it away. But then also it will restore the land. It will renew it. Yeah. And so, the flood happens. And so we almost have like this sort of, when the waters come back over the earth, this is the uncreating of the world, because in Genesis 1, where it's talked about how the world is basically just covered in water. And so when the flood happens, it's literally the uncreating of the world. And here's Noah riding the uncreation out in his little ark with he's a seed, and he's got all of life stored in there. And he's just bobbing along, and then the waters recede, and it's planted in the earth, and the curse on the land is ended. I think. And that's the curse of Cain, and it ends with Noah, and he tries to plant a garden. Well, he plants a vineyard, then he gets drunk in it and naked. And there's this funny inversion of the Garden of Eden, where you had Adam and Eve unashamed in their nakedness in the garden, and then you have Noah just drunk as a skunk in his vineyard, and he's just naked. Like,
naked and ashamed.
Yeah, well, he
wasn't ashamed, but
then his son saw him, and there's this whole thing that kind of like exposes that that we're not back in the garden again. Anyway, but all that sort of the fire through the forest, the flood, that's a U-shaped journey. And what's the purpose of a flood? The purpose was to restore the land, to bring back its ability to grow things. When Adam falls into the deep sleep, what was the purpose of that? For Eve to come out. When Christ dies on the cross, he's renewing creation, and he's actually creating all things new. And then also the church is born, as the sword pierces his side, just like out of Adam's side came Eve, then out of Christ's side comes the church, the
Yeah.
issue of water and blood, that's a, we haven't talked about birth yet. Maybe we could talk about,
Yeah.
but it's Christ is giving birth to something that was inside of him. And now it is out there, and it's supposed, just like Adam and Eve, like Adam needed a helpmeet or whatever. I don't know what that is, but like, what is the church to Christ? It's his bride. It's his helper. It's so like it how to bring this in, like, because there's a great metaphor about birth and about being and becoming, where, like I said about the U-shaped journey, the purpose is not to manipulate it or try to control it, but to go through it. And that's exactly what what women are told about birth. That's what the midwife told my wife when she was giving birth to my kids, was like, you just have to go through it. And you don't get to control it. You don't get to, you you carry the child and then you give birth, and all kinds of things can happen and go wrong in that process. And it's not, and it just goes to show you how this is not, it's a perilous, it's perilous.
It's wrought with all kinds of risks and pain and suffering. And but without the process, nothing is. Nothing new is born. Nothing becomes real, right? Like you say.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this too. Like when Jesus talks about the narrow gate, having to go through the narrow gate. I thought of that as actually what birth is.
It is.
Like biologically, the head of a human being is actually too big to get through there. Like it had that gate has to open up, which is what causes all the pain. Actually, that's where most of the pain is found, is right there in that process of this gate, this narrow gate, right? That the child has to pass through, the head of the child. And
and that would, and the same thing with the camel through the eye of the needle. It says, like, how does a wealthy man get into heaven? Well, like the camel through the eye of the needle. And the eye of the needle was a smaller gate, and the camels had, I think the main thing is that the camels had to be unloaded of all their stuff. All the stuff has to be unloaded, and the camel can crawl through.
Yeah,
that's how. All the stuff has to be. Yeah, the stuff doesn't go through with the camel. The same thing, and being born again. And
pretty obvious.
Yeah, the scripture is just like ripe with this language, and we talk about it all the time, and I don't think we know what we're talking about. That, and even in like the iconography, like the grave is the shape of a birth canal. It's the grave where Christ was. He went in, and then he came out, and he came out new. And so you're just like, what the heck is like, it's like Jonathan says, like everything is in Christ. Like he both gives birth and he's born. And where did he go? Like he went down to Hades, he went to hell, and then he brought everything with him through the gate, through the, and
that's why he calls himself the way.
Right.
I believe, like the whole, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but the whole idea of Christ's death on the cross being some form of transaction between God and mankind, some kind of financial arrangement where debts are paid. Just, that's to me not the story that I see. That's not the story we're talking about. What we're talking about is that there a way is made, right?
Mm-hmm.
He goes down and he comes out what? Head first. Hello. And we are what? The body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when a child is born properly, that's how they're born.
Yep.
Head first. And then the body follows.
That's funny. Never thought about that.
It's all there, Jess. It's all there.
Christ is the head of the church. Now, yeah, that's and you get the sense in like, well, like I was talking about Christ on the cross, and that, you know, this is his divine will sort of being made manifest back toward the Father, and he goes down into the grave, and then we see the will of the transcendent towards his son, which is to raise him up again. And this is the deal we make with God. We're like, he's like, he gives us space to be and become, and to die, right? And he's like, you have to trust me about my will towards you, that I'm going to bring you back up again. New.
Well, then you're going to become something. You know,
something
like
else.
That little pine cone goes down into the dirt. That must be pretty scary. Like if the pine cone had eyes, he'd look rather worried.
It's like my mom just dropped me in the dirt.
and then it gets dark, right? And
maybe all winter.
It happens in the fall.
Yep.
And suddenly it freezes. You know, it's like solid as a rock. It's terrifying. It's terrifying down at the bottom. Terrifying. It's dark. It's cold. It's lonely. You know, and but in order to become the thing that we were meant to be, like the pine cone, we have to go through it.
Yep.
Right. And to kick at it is to not participate in being itself.
Right.
You know, and that's God, you know, because it's in him that we live and move and have our being, right? We are becoming, but we are also nested in being, you know, which is very descriptive of a uterus and a child in the womb, right? They're becoming something, and they are nested in something, in being itself, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the beauty of this story, is that it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Well, even in the story of Job, it's said that there's a hedge of protection around Job.
Yeah.
He's in a womb.
Yeah.
And he's very successful. He's become everything a good man can. He's too big for that space.
Yeah.
God wants him sent out into the world. And so what happens is the hedge of protection is broken. Everything that he had is left behind, destroyed. And he sits there, and what does he do? He just cries.
Like a baby.
Yeah. And I think that, you know,
and he wishes he wasn't born. And I bet you anything.
Right.
I bet you anything, when a baby is born, they're having that same thought.
Right. I think it's such a brilliant thing about how that whoever wrote Job wrote it, is because the first thing Job does is he laments his birth.
Yeah.
Says, I wish I was never born.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what happened in that moment. He was born into a different world. And everyone's trying to explain like what happened to him. And, you know, like, oh, this was about justice, and how, you know, and this is about, you know, God's trying to teach you something, or God's trying to punish you, or, you know, whatever. And Job,
none of it is relevant. Yeah.
Job instinctually is like, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. he's like, you have zero wisdom. Nothing of what you're saying applies. And Job doesn't know either. He's all over the place. He's basically just crying out. And then we see the heart of the Father back towards him, which is to come to him and then make him something, like make him greater. And,
well, in essence, Job is also saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? Like his will is directed towards the Father, right? When he doesn't buy into all the reasons, all the rational, logical reasons.
Right. The arguments his friends make are like, Job, obviously God can do no wrong. Obviously. So there must have been something. So just, even if you don't understand, just humble yourself, repent, and God is good and he'll receive you again. Like you can see how that is just like you can just imagine a pastor saying that to someone today.
Of course.
Because it sounds great and maybe applicable, but they didn't take seriously what was happening to Job and what he was talking about. And then Job was right to be upset.
Like if you convert that story into the story of a childbirth, right? Where, Job is born into this world of suffering and pain, which a child is, right? And the child wishes it wasn't born, right? And then a whole bunch of nurses and doctors stand around it and say all the things to the child that Job's friends said to him.
Right.
And the child's like, that's bullshit. Right?
Right.
And what does the child do? It orients itself to the mother and the father, right? Who love it into being, right? It's not done, right? Just because it filled up the space within the womb doesn't mean that the journey is now over.
Right.
It's the journey has just begun.
Right.
That one is over. This is over, right? But this one has begun. And now it's, and the only responsibility that the parents have to the child, or the only, actually not responsibility, the only thing they can do for that child is to love it into being.
Yep.
Right. That's agape. And so, and that's what God does. And that's why he's confident in Job, because he knows there's no other thing for Job to do. Right. It's like when the baby is born, there's nothing else for that child to do but to become something.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. The whole, I hear people talk about how Job is just a story about psychological transformation. I think it's that too, but it's how everything transforms. It's how everything becomes something, and how dynamic this creation is, and what God is doing. And that
also the story of Job is the story that we find ourselves in this world. It's the moral and ethical dilemma of pain and suffering and evil.
Yep.
That's what it is. Right. And God is telling us something about that. We're covered in blood when we're born.
Yep.
It's not pretty, right? It isn't. And it involves death and pain and suffering. It's all a part of it. And one of the things that I've had to think about a lot is what is my definition of good and my definition of bad when it comes to the way God sees things. And, when I realized that when God was talking about the ostrich, he was talking about Christ. That's what God does. Like I said this the other day on the Voxer, we think this is good. And so like Sam Harris, we think, we got to promote that because that's going to promote human flourishing. Right.
Right.
No, really. That's what
I know.
And we can make such a mess out of that. Because sometimes, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. The story isn't about that. The story is about pain and suffering and death. Mm-hmm. That's what Christ went through. That's what Job went through. That's what Adam and Eve went through. Those are all the same stories, mm-hmm. right? And so how then should we think about the good and the bad? Well, I would just say, for me anyway, I've had to let go of it. I've had to let go of what I think is good and what is bad completely, and just say, well, I don't know.
Let it be.
I'm like a baby. I'm like a baby in the hands of God, right? And whenever I encounter anything, whether it's good or bad, that's where I'm nested, right? Mm-hmm. That's where I sit. And so I just have to have faith that my Father is good, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I say the only thing I know is that God is good. God is good, right? And whatever I go through, however painful it might be, I'll be okay. Even if I die, mm-hmm. like even if I physically die, I'll be okay.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's the only way we can.
And that's the other thing, Jess. We have to, you see, God inverts all these things, right? He's just constantly like, we go, okay, that's good. That's the fall. That's bad. Mm-hmm. That's, and he just goes wrench, just throwing them, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
and the other big wrench is death, right? Like I said this morning on the box, at the bottom of every fear is the fear of death. That's what's at the bottom of it. Mm-hmm. I watched a really good, I can't share it because it's in German, but I watched this really good thing yesterday about Corona and fear. And it was done by this guy. He's I don't know how to translate it. Friedensforscher, which is like a peace researcher, in like international foreign relations or whatever. What do you call that? Foreign policies. But he talks about, and this, I'm just going to go off on a little tangent, but we don't have to go down this road or anything. But he talks about the fear that people have. Like he said, when it comes to Corona. So for some people, it's an existential fear. They're gonna lose their business, right? Their business gets shut down. Say it's a restaurant, and it was, the lockdowns happen, and they're not going to survive. And this restaurant has been in their family for 3 generations or something, which happens a lot in Europe, right?
Yeah.
And so they're worried about surviving. They're worried about poverty, living on the street, right? Losing their home. And then you've got people who are afraid of the disease, right? Mm-hmm. And then you've got people who are afraid of a dictatorship. So you have these 3 fears. And when these 3 individuals, let's say, come together and talk with each other, none of them know what the other person is talking about, because their fear is seated in this one thing.
Right, this one.
And ultimately, that fear is the fear of death.
Yep.
Right? Dictators kill people. Disease kills people. Poverty kills people. And that's what people are afraid of. And so, and John Bear makes the point that, and we talked about this before we started recording, but that our society has done a really good job of keeping death at more than arm's length, I would say. More than arm's length. And just as I've had to think about, well, it's kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly, isn't it? Death being the ugly. I've had to think about, I've had to say to myself, I don't know what's good and I don't know what's bad. And I need to acquaint myself with death, because that's where I'm going. I'm always going there. There's no escaping it. And I'm going there eventually at the end of my life. I'm going there every day. I'm dying, right? Like it's always happening. And so I need to acquaint myself with it because it's
Die to yourself.
What's that?
Die to yourself.
Yeah, right. And it's the thing by which all things are made new. Jesus died, right? In order to do that, to make the way. So anyway, I just wanted to say
no, that's really good. And I like to make the differentiation, or I don't know, that there's a difference between dying and death. Like we will die, but death is something that we fear.
Well, it's gone, actually. It's been removed.
Well, that's the thing. That's what Christ did. He got rid of death. Yeah. He didn't get rid of dying.
No.
He got rid of death. And that was the thing we feared when we ate the fruit. And what did we see? That's why I think we saw Christ, is because we saw death.
Right. Okay.
And we were afraid, and we didn't trust God anymore because we saw what happened to his son. Right. And there's an aspect of that where we're afraid of that and we don't trust God. And that's kind of like it, I think that's the foundational existential spiritual problem is our fear of death and basically that's rooted in not trusting God. It's not pride. I mean, there is that too. There is, but that fear of death and lack of trust is because if you can rebuild that again, then that trust, which is what I think Christ tried to do. He did. He defeated death. Death no longer has a sting. So like I was talking with my dad a while back and we were just like, I was like, Dad, what if there was a time when there's no more death? Like people still died, but there was no more death. Like what would that world look like? Death would have been eradicated, because we don't fear it. We don't, it doesn't do the thing we thought it did, because
I think we can have that mindset though, Jess, as Christians. I think that is critical actually, because we say it and but I mean, it's human. It's only human to fear death. I mean, we are given an innate sense of self-preservation, which includes the fear of death. But I think
I wouldn't say like that instinctual thing is wrong.
No, that's
like
not wrong.
It's much deeper. It's trying to all the things we do to protect ourselves from death. So like building up wealth and building up walls and wielding weapons and or even
killing our brother,
our brother, or even on the opposite side where you then will go out and you'll kill others. You'll try to kill yourself. You'll try to wield it in that way. You won't just let it be.
Well, you're not going to participate, right? You're not going to.
Right. Like I'm going to control this.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly. And that's precisely what Adam and Eve did. They controlled something, right? Mm-hmm. They wielded and then they became obsessed with their own death, basically, mm-hmm. their own nakedness and their vulnerability, which, like I often think about the human body as being like a little pin cushion, right? Like it's so fragile.
just stick it with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, loading the stove with wood and stuff. And if I don't wear gloves,
splinters,
just from picking up a log, and it just happens so quick. And I'm like, geez, I'm so freaking fragile. Or, I haven't shoveled for a while, and then I go out and start tossing the compost or whatever, and suddenly I'm covered in blisters. Like I'm not cut out. My body is not cut out for this world. It's very fragile. It's very fragile. And I think it's fragile for a reason, but that's another topic altogether. But there was something I was going to say about this. I'm wondering about the idea of trusting God, because I'm not sure. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, because I'm not sure. I have a feeling I disagree with it, but I don't know if I do.
Oh, let's see. I've never elaborated on it before, but I think it, I think it has to do with something that, like if this pattern exists, like within the relationship of the Trinity, I don't think I've fleshed that out quite enough, but so like I talked about the space. So something else can be that's separate from the infinite and ineffable.
Right.
Because how does something exist apart from God? Well, in some ways it can't, but in some ways it has to in order to be something different. Like, because we're not, otherwise you're just into pantheism where everything is just God. Obviously,
yeah.
We're not doing that. I think there's problems with that. But there's a way in which God holds us up, but we also have our own like will. We have our own being in an aspect.
Personhood.
And so that we're made in the image of God. I think we're made in the image of Christ, so that Christ kind of, it talks about like Christ is begotten of the Father in wisdom. Right. So the wisdom's the Spirit, and it gets complicated because Christ is also wisdom. But just go with me here that like there's this space, this in God's wisdom, the Son is begotten. And so there's a sense in which the Son goes out and then returns to the Father, and then goes out and returns to the Father. And that's how the Son is finite. The Son is particular. The Son is specific. Mm-hmm. It's something that the Son has qualities about him that you can describe that and things about him that are not him. He's not a tree, but the tree has particularity like the Son has. So in the degree which something is like has a particularity about it, it's actually participating in Christ because it has particularity, it has specificity. And so since it's all within the Trinity there, like this going out and coming back and this separation and return, it's kind of this breathing and breathing out that sustains the particular, that sustains the finite, that sustains what I would just say being in general. Right. And this is the creator God, how things become, and everything is an imitation of that. So at its very basic level, and a subatomic particle has its being because it's imitating that aspect of Christ, and then it just scales up from there.
Yeah,
and you almost, I see it as a giant symphony that that God loves his Son so much that he just wants more.
Right.
And you can kind of get that. You can get that in the Genesis account. Sorry, I'm just like, I get choked up over this. But you get that in the Genesis account where God just says, God's not shaping every little tree and every plant. He just says, let there be trees. And all the trees just go, here we are.
Yeah.
And there's
well, it's, I think what's so beautiful about that, Jess, is the preservation of personhood, right? Like that is also very revelatory of God's love as a father. Like if, I had 3 children, and if I gave birth to the same kid every time, it would be really weird.
Right.
I'd be like, oh my God, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like it's their individuality, their personhood that I love, right? And and this is what creation is to God. Like I also said that this morning, it's about personhood. It's everything is this multiplicity is all unified in the Father, right? Because he loves it.
Right.
And And it's like, the idea was like the glory, right? The glory of everything has a different glory. Well, yeah, that's, to me, that's personhood. That's their glory.
Yeah.
It's their personhood, and God loves it. Like it's glory because it's just magnificent to watch them become something. And the same feeling we have with our own children, right? It's glorious to watch them become something. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the original question that you had at the beginning before I went into the Trinity stuff? About trusting God.
Trusting.
So, this is about and everything's following this pattern of Christ. You can see it in all of creation, that this pattern of the seed falling and dying and being and springing forth new and fulfilling its purpose. And then you see the fires purifying the forest, and you see the floods renewing the fields and the ground, and you see animals giving birth and carrying their young and then giving birth and then raising them, and you see all this variety of how it all happens. Everything from the ostrich who just leaves their eggs on the ground and runs away, and then
good thing it's warm in Australia.
And then all the way to people where like you have this infant you're taking care of for a year and taking care of it even longer, like for 10, 12, 15 years to get it to a place where it can survive on its own. And you just see this this continually like play out, and you see Christ wrestle with this in his full consciousness of what's going on, that he says in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, not my will, but your will.
Yeah.
And
okay, I see what you're going.
We also see that in Mary when God comes to her and she says, let it be.
Yeah.
So,
it's a complete surrender.
Yeah. And it's everything happening at once, because like, not only are we becoming and we're growing, we're also carrying things in us that God wants us to birth. That metaphor is always used in like charismatic circles. They're like, God has something in you. He wants to birth through you. And so weird. And
visions of the movie Alien kind of go through my mind.
but I mean, women literally do that. And then, and when, there's a lot of pain associated with that. If you can't do that, or if something goes wrong, and there's just like,
you can also abandon that whole metaphor for those who don't give birth on a regular basis, like men. Okay. Although some men are nowadays, but you could also do the infinite, as in the imagination being made finite through the application of whatever it is, whatever technical skills you have, right? So like we talked about this with Nate in that one conversation, and that's also a giving birth, right? Where you have all this potential and you have to choose the thing, and then it has to be born through you. But the creative process itself is also painful and involves pain and suffering, because you have to learn it, right? Like riding the bike. There, you have to learn how to ride the bike, and it involves failing and falling down. And, for me, like I think about spinning and learning the process of spinning. Well, it's not something that, you read about, go to bed, wake up the next morning and you can do it. It doesn't happen like that. It happens through trial and error and frustration and impatience and anger and all the rest of those things, right? Like, so whenever something is being born, it you just don't get there without the pain and suffering, I don't think.
Yeah. And even like the metaphor of like using like the potter and the clay,
Yeah.
like the clay is like just a pure, nice ball of clay. It's just, but it's nothing. It's just pure clay. And then when you start to form it, like you're halfway between this sort of pure, innocent clay and then what it could become. And that whole process is like, it's messy. There, you know, it could collapse in on itself and, you know, have to start again, or, you know, there's all kinds of things that can, and, you know, during the process, you're like, what the heck is going on? Why I'm supposed to be a vase. And then what is he doing? Like, it doesn't feel, and then, you know, cause just looking at creation and stuff, like there's just so much variety and repetition and like building on themes and like just nothing's ever the same, but also God's like, let's do it again and again and again. and like there's so many different, you know, there's so many different stars and plants and trees and animals and jellyfish, and, you know, there seems to be this sort of like joy in repeating things and and all of that, and you know, you look at, you know, you could look at any part of it and be like, well, this shark is eating this fish, how is that fair? You know, and all of a sudden you're off track. You're like, do you,
that's missing the mark.
Yeah, you know, the fish and the shark are participating in something that's been going on for forever, as far as we're concerned. Like, and then we want to judge it, and we want to say, well, that doesn't seem right.
Well, then we, you know, pull out our little good and bad judgments, right?
Knowledge
that's
of good and evil.
That's bad. Yeah. That's when we pull them out. And that's why I would just really encourage people to throw them away.
Well, yeah.
Get rid of those because you really, you know.
Well, someone might think like, okay, so we're going to throw out good and bad and we're just going to let things be. Like, no. The thing is that you need to participate in creation.
Right. That's what I was going to say next, Jess. It's not just tossing out all your morality. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about not deliberating about it anymore, but just going with it. Like, as long as you're rightly oriented, like Christ, right? Your will is rightly oriented to the Father. I mean, Jesus could have said, look, that's bad. Right. When he looked at the cross. No, that's really bad.
Right.
Pain and suffering. No, I'm not doing that. Right. But he didn't, he was oriented and he went with it. Right. Mm-hmm. He participated in being without judging the thing as good or bad. No,
he went through it.
Well, because he knows one thing, that his Father is good.
Yeah. He trusted his Father.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like that it's such because then it keeps you from being disengaged, because being disengaged from something is not participating with creation. You're just like, well, I'm not going to do anything because it's not because I don't want to judge about this. You know, if you see something that needs to be tended to, you tend to it. And if you see someone that needs being brought up and built up, then you do that. And it's all done through love. So we can be a part of creation. We can be a part of the ongoing dynamic process. And it's not just there is, you know, the aspect of it that we've fallen, we've sinned. We're you know, all this stuff, like we're separated from God, but do we see how that plays into God's hands as a creator? Because for me, it's just like God already knows how to handle. This is not a problem.
Well, that's
and he will attend to it and he will take care of it because.
Well, he knows the process.
He knows the process.
Right. He knows what it's like. Any kind of process. If you are familiar with a process and you go and you watch the thing that you're processing go through it, you know what it's going to be in the end. This is why I say God didn't trust Job in that sense. He knew the process. He knew. That's why when like I would love to see someone do like an animation of God and Satan, because Satan's kind of wandering around, he's wandering to and fro. So I imagine he's kind of bored. He's just like, spinning around in circles. And then God goes, hey, have you seen Job? Right. And if you take that story as a creation story, he's like, hey, have you seen humanity? Have you seen humanity?
Mm-hmm.
And then then Satan says, well, yeah, you're looking after them. That's why they're in the garden. And God says, no, you can go mess around with them, but just don't kill them. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. And it turns the whole story around because all of a sudden God is turning everything. Satan against himself. Satan wants to destroy, and Satan ends up playing into the hands of God, who's using it to create.
Yeah. I know. There's the wrench.
There's the wrench.
Have fun with that, everybody. Because Satan doesn't say, oh, hey, God, I saw Job and I want to try to torment him. Is that okay? No. Mm-hmm. He's just wandering around, bored. And God's like, you want something to do?
You want something to do. Well, then we're like, is God actually causing pain and suffering to you?
That's I don't even know if that's even worth asking. Like,
it's just
that's kind of that's a question that makes you question God's goodness. And I don't think that you can question God's goodness because that's the only thing you know. That's the only thing I know is God's goodness. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when I ask that question, did he cause pain and suffering? Then that's the wrong question to me. Right. Mm-hmm. The question is actually, what is the pain and suffering for? It just is. Right.
Yeah, it just is.
And this is the story of Job. Job is in the midst of it, And it was really interesting because I went to my first Orthodox service and the homily was actually about this. You would have loved it.
Yeah.
And he said oftentimes when we go through some pain and suffering, we think that, I just got to get to the other side of it, right? I got to get to the other side of it. And then I'll be able to, get back to God or
back to normal,
go back to church or back to normal or whatever the thing is. But he said, that's not where God is. He's in the midst of it. He's in the midst of your pain and suffering. That's where you meet him, right? That's what the cross is. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's also where God dwelt with the Israelites in the midst of their pain and suffering, right? So thinking about causes and deliberating whether something is good or bad, I think that's not my job. That's how I think of it.
Yeah.
My job is to understand what's going on right here and now, because now is the only thing that exists, really, right? And I'm not saying I do it well. I've been through pain and suffering, and I haven't responded properly. Mm-hmm.
But I think
I actually don't think God expects us to.
No, that's the other thing is we're not expected to actually have it all together.
No.
So like responding correctly, like you look at Job, how he responded by wanting to be uncreated, wish he hadn't been born. And God didn't come down and say that's, in a way God was like, that's foolishness, but didn't come down and like make an argument about why you should have been born and why. He just said, here's the glory of creation. Can you understand even the smallest part of it?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't even Job that he was angry with. Job had to make a sacrifice and pray for his friends because God was really pissed off with them, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because, and then everyone brings him some gold too. Job becomes priest and king at the end because everyone brings a tax to him, some gold. And then he also offers a sacrifice for everyone. He becomes the priest and like mediates between them and God because of what he went through. And it's exactly what you said was like, Job met God in the midst, and that's and
like MacDonald points out so well, and I never thought of it until I read that sermon. He made a claim on him as his creator, right? As the creature to the creator, and MacDonald makes that point so beautifully because that is the greatest exercise of faith, right? That is the my God, why hast thou forsaken me, that Jesus cries out on the cross. It actually means that God exists, right? You can't make a claim on something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's the baby crying out for its mother.
Yeah.
And you know, this is about like, you know, how do we respond in suffering? Like, it doesn't matter. You just cry out. Like usually that's the right response, and the wrong response is to be like Job at the very beginning says of his trial, or his sufferings says, naked I came from the womb, naked I'll go, blessed be the name of the Lord. There's this real stoicism about Job at first that's very religious and was correct and was the right response. And you know, then his friends come and they sit in silence for 7 days, and then he just cracks and he just starts wailing basically. And
7 days is a long time to figure out what the heck is going on when you've lost.
And he can't even figure it out. He's just like, I just wish I was never born.
Not possible.
And you know, to be like, well, what's the right response in suffering? You're just like, that's the wrong question too. Like, it has nothing to do, like, what God is a good father that's going to respond to your cries.
Yep.
And also he's more interested in you becoming something than he is about keeping you safe, we'll say.
Yeah.
Because your being is the most valuable thing in the universe. And so by whatever will make you be, he'll allow.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily like, you know, I asked the question, like, does God cause this? You know, there's a sense in which because of the separation God has made, because creation's distinct from God, it's held up by God, I think. You know, we're not pantheists, like I said, so it's not like God is everything. He's in the tree, but in a sense, he's holding everything together. But because of the separation, there's a lot of wills at play. There's gravity. There's wild animals. There's other people. There's but this kind of view of the U-shaped journey in creation just shows how, like, no matter what happens, it plays into God's hands and he can use it. It's like I'll, you know, whatever tragedy happens, God will use that as the raw materials to make more stuff.
Right.
And make more beings and make you.
And the worst thing that you think could happen to you, dying, is actually the thing that makes you new.
Well, yeah, we've been dancing around it, but in this whole thing, like, dying is being born.
Yeah.
Like, we're in the womb, and there's this, you know, like you talked about, it's not just one U-shaped journey or whatever. This is like nested
Fractal.
U's inside U's. It's a fractal. And so like,
And I love
we're
that
all
metaphor
on, like-
that you said about weaving, you know, because traditionally speaking, Mary,
weaver.
the mother of Jesus, was a
Yeah, yeah,
weaver.
she wove the temple that hung in the Holy of
The veil.
the veil.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's just U-shaped journeys all the way down, Jess. And up again.
But I just think it's such a more beautiful vision than
It is.
a substitutionary atonement theory.
Yeah.
Even though that happens in it, I think this is,
Well, I don't think it actually does. It absolves you of actually going down, descending, right? It's like, oh no, you don't have to go
well,
there.
there's that.
Jesus did that, right? And he paid for you. So you're good. You're good. He built a bridge right over that thing, that big abyss, that pit, that personal hell or whatever it is.
Like prosperity
and
gospel.
And I don't really want to wade into this, but I think that the problem with that perspective is that all of a sudden, when you are dying in some way, whether it's physical or spiritual or emotionally or whatever, or physically, you're like, what the heck's going on? And then you become like Job's friends.
Yeah.
I must have done something wrong.
Yep.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
it says that if you take communion and don't have all your ducks in a row, that some people die, Oh, this has to be my fault. And it's particularly that frame of mind that God rejects in the book of Job. He fully rejects it.
He
Like,
doesn't
no,
even
that
address it. It's
nothing.
not even like in his picture.
Has
He's like,
nothing to do.
has
it makes
nothing
him
to do
mad.
with it.
It
Yeah.
makes him mad, actually, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And he's just like, no, this is you're missing the mark. You're missing the whole point. You're missing the whole point.
Yeah.
My wisdom is foolishness to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's Christ.
Right.
That is Christ.
Right.
Yeah. I guess it's a good note to end on. We've been
It is good.
Well, over 2 hours. That was great.
I'll stop the recording then.
Okay.
Thanks, Shari. Oh, wait.